Hello, everyone. Welcome back again. We're moving to the next stage of our event, and this is the part where we're talking about emerging populism, the African people, and its states of policy. Before we go on, I'm inviting everyone to tweet the hashtag Strides of Change Africa, and let audiences and everybody on Twitter and the other social media worlds know what is happening. Before I go on and introduce my panelists, one of whom who's addressed us and you're already familiar with, I would give you a bit of a background instead of the concept that was envisaged when the organizers were thinking about the panel. And so in the concept, and you may all already have this, we're thinking about how Africa has been characterized by different questions of problematic governance, forced, prolonged regimes, and in many instances, subjugation of its people. And these issues, as we all know, have been overlapped by complicated and multifaceted instances of Western influence and also harsh socioeconomic difficulties. We also combine this with questions of religion, ethnicity, gender, that has been, over a period of time, the African story as a lot of people know it. In this few years, a number of people are pushing back on this narrative, right? We're seeing citizens pushing back on leadership and various forms of policy anomalies, as we've seen, whether it's in the Arab Spring in Egypt or the NSAS movement in Nigeria, or even currently now in Ghana with the Fix the Country protest that young people have embarked on. It seems that this is the ripe moment to rethink the ways in which citizens and young audiences can be engaged in the policy process, whether or not there's a pathway within the system for systemic change within the status quo, whether we can deploy the tools of our many African states, what is some framework of a democracy to change the status quo, or we have to deploy non-democratic means to produce systemic change. These are all various forms of questions that I'll be hoping to engage my audiences on as we think about how do we expand the discourse beyond populism, how we ensure that this leads to more elaborate and sophisticated engagements with an African democracy, with our own civic identity, and also with other systems of change which are burgeoning in how people-centered narratives of leadership in Africa is happening. The very first guest that you're all aware of already is His Excellency Robert Santamun, or as I have preferred to call him, Bobi Wine, because I suppose there's more draw to Bobi Wine. Would you agree, Robert, than your real name today? But yes, as he said himself, he began his music career in the early 2000s and adopted the stage name Bobi Wine. He had several singles and various hit songs which have been featured in a number of Hollywood movies as well. And it's one of the most prolific musicians you've ever thought about. In the past 15 years, he's had various hits. But also in that way of engaging audiences through music and talking about social issues, it's found also that the conversation can happen through music, but it can also go beyond music. It can engage different audiences and different people in other ways. And that is how come we know him now. And in the last 2021 Ugandan presidential elections, he decided to put himself forward, to change the conversation in his country and to also give a lot of young people a perspective that change is possible. Now, it's obviously a star-studded lineup as well. I'm happy to be joined by Golda Addo. Golda, I know for a very long time, who is a trainer, a researcher, and also a strategist for a number of businesses and projects on the continent. She has had a lot of experience in questions of monitoring and evaluation, communications, how you ensure resource-based management, and also how you engage policies within structures and also engage structures in themselves. For the past 13 years, Golda has consulted for various foreign donors and government top officers. She's done work with civil society, private sector, and worked in several African countries, including Benin, Nigeria, Liberia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Tunisia. I feel like I'm going to mention all the continents that you've worked, all the countries on the continent that you've worked on. And it's that rich background and understanding of the issues that she's bringing onto the into the conversations. She's also done work and is a member currently of the Climate Change Committee within the context of the International Leaders Program, and also has been hosted by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office on various global issues. I look forward to engaging Golda as well on in her role as chair of the Gender for Results, which is an AFDB or African Development Bank hosted platform for African development, where she had been from 2013 to 2016 and has worked with over 100 women all across the continent. It's my pleasure as well to introduce Greg Mills. Greg is the director of the Johannesburg-based Brenthurst Foundation. He was educated at the University of Cape Town and also at Lancaster, which I'm hoping that the Cambridge audiences do not hold against him. He has taught at also various universities in the Western Cape and Cape Town from 1990 to 1994. And in that period, specifically between 1994 and 1996, he has been a director of studies at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And from 1996 to 2005, its national director. In 2008, he was deployed as strategic advisor to the president of Rwanda. From 2007 to 2012, he directed the secretariat to the Presidential International Advisory Board in Mozambique. And from 2012 to 2014, he was the Presidential Advisory Committee on the Economy of Malawi. Again, you see from the profile of the speakers that we're bringing on board, the people who have worked across the continent and have their fingers are on the pulse and understand the issues as we understand it and have engaged with them, can think outside of the box about how we solve problems on the continent generally. And I'm happy to have these distinguished individuals in the conversation. Perhaps one of the things I wanted to start with, and I may start with Robert Bobi Wine on this, since it's now become the face of what people are calling an emerging African populism. What does that mean to him, and whether he thinks it's a right phrase or terminology to use in these kinds of conversations? Robert.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Hi, Golda. Hi, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here with you. For starters, I'll say, Oliver, that I did not get into music because I had the best voice or the best talent. It was a very kind introduction of you, and I'll thank you once again for introducing me as one of the most prolific artists. Oh my God, I feel overwhelmed. Like I was saying, I didn't get into music because I had the best talent or the most lovely voice, but largely because I felt I had something to say. And in the same breath, I did not get into politics because I had super knowledge of policy and all that. But again, it was because I felt that the voice I had built through music had to speak, and not only to speak musically, but I wanted to take it a notch higher and say the things that I felt should be said. And this comes at the backdrop of what largely is seen by the section of people that feel largely represented by me, the common people, the ghetto people, who felt like their plight was not being addressed, and indeed were not being well represented by those that were there. So it's on that background that I rose, or I presented myself. And again, I want to say that it is not just the fact that I'm a popular person, but because of the things that I stand for. We find ourselves in a time in Africa generally, and in East Africa and in Uganda in particular, where there's so much that is not being addressed by those that are supposed to address. So my rise was more like a frustration of a certain section of a population, which happens to be the largest. If we look at it, for example, in Uganda, over 80% are young people, and indeed over 80% are unemployed and living below the poverty line. That is a particular site on Uganda, but I believe it is largely representation of many parts of Africa. So it is on that note that I rise. I rise much as the majority of the population here in Uganda, in East Africa, and I believe in Africa, share the same plight. But I present myself to say what I believe represents me, and this happens to represent very many people, especially the young people. So for the young people, having the entertainment, but again, feeling their voice protruding through the entertainment and through the popular culture, I want to believe that is what I represent to the present day. I am glad that by and large, the young people tend to resonate with what we say. We are speaking from not from a professional point of view, but from a realistic point of view, and from a voice that has always wanted to be amplified, and that's a voice that I amplify. So from my point of view, that's the meaning of populism or popular culture or advocacy for that matter.
Let me bring Golda into the conversation. Golda, I mean, I think what Bobi is driving at is populism. What people are calling populism is only people sharing their lived experiences I suppose, in a much more engaged way. Now, in your experience working on the continent over these years, have you seen this sort of energy and drive mark the way most citizens are engaging their leadership, or is there something different that we are witnessing?
Mouse, so I've had to turn my video off because it looks like my internet connectivity is not the best. I just want to make sure that you can all hear me at least. With regards, great. With regards to what I have experienced in Ghana and probably a few of the West African countries over the past few years regarding populism, I believe that it's evident we are experiencing that. What has turned out to be more insightful for me as I paid more attention to this situation is that much as I don't want to send us backwards into the colonial era, we are coming to terms with people beginning to reach their maturity in terms of what must we expect in terms of governance in our country. People are beginning to be more aware and more expectant. And because of the awareness of what the standards or benchmarks should be, we are beginning to see people finding more interest and enthusiasm for the leaders who show themselves to be on their side and not simply standing for elitism. And therefore, we are beginning to have more and more Africans coming into their own in terms of the realization. It might not be the concept or the term itself that they want to actualize or implement. It's simply their way of saying we deserve better if this is truly a democracy, and we will make sure that we will put you in the situation where you will have to provide it to us, and this is in brief what I feel about populism across the continent.
Thanks for that, for Golda, for those perspectives as well about the sense of urgency that we are seeing. One of the things I wanted to talk about, Greg, before we go down into questions of results and measuring it and impact and all of that, is, do you feel like the conversations are happening in an ecosystem where it's happening in East Africa, then you have a West Africa, you have Southern Africa, or do you find that people are building bridges and community, or even taking inspiration from across the borders in the way in which the conversation is being had?
Oh, thank you very much, Oliver. Very nice to meet you, albeit virtually, and Golda as well. And it's wonderful to see my brother, Robert, also on the screen. Bobi is, of course, a very famous artist, and he once had a very infamous collaborator on one of his songs, which was at the start of the COVID crisis. It was a great honor to stretch my musical skills with him. So for those of you who want to be entertained, go and look for the video, Alone but All Together. I've just finished a road trip. Well, I'm 100 kilometers from finishing a road trip. I'm up the west coast of South Africa. I've driven all the way from Lilongwe in Malawi down through Mozambique, across Zimbabwe, through Botswana and into Namibia and down into South Africa. And there are many things that have struck me in the course of this 5,000 kilometer trip. One of them is the inverse proportionality between the presence of army and police and governance and democracy. The more the presence of army and police, the less the governance and democracy, multiple roadblocks in the weakest countries. And so reliance on more prosaic elements of statehood rather than on the softer touch, the soft power elements of statehood. Well, I would just make a couple of points to begin with. I think the first of these is that given the population increases in Africa that are projected, doubling over the next generation, essentially this demands an end to business as usual as we understand it in terms of the way in which governments operate, the policies that governments carry out, the relatively lax connection between governments and their peoples. So we can't afford, with this rate of population increase, if we're going to enjoy the demographic dividend that we all hope for, to carry on with business as usual as we have become used to it. The second related aspect is about democracy itself and the empirical correlation between quality of democracy and economic performance is much clearer today than it's ever been before. There's a much clearer understanding about the quality of democracy and the way in which governments are able to diversify their economies, put in place governance systems that are attractive to external investors, for example, as well as the other aspects of democracy about respect for the rule of law, human rights, and so on. So there's a direct correlation, and I don't think we should try and brush this under the carpet. I think a third point I would make is that governments, particularly national liberation movements, which tend to govern in Southern Africa, have a particular style of governance. And in many cases, they seem to be reducing their support base. I was speaking to a minister yesterday in Namibia about this. Their support base is diminishing, particularly among younger people, precisely because of the relative underperformance of the economies, which is likely again to be exacerbated by population increases. So they are resorting almost invariably to increasingly radical forms of popular appeal in order to be able to offset the decrease in support as a consequence of not being able to answer the questions that people want to see answered about jobs, growth, education, healthcare, etc., infrastructure, and so on. And I think that what we have seen, and this is to your question particularly, Oliver, what we have seen to an extent in Africa is that civil society increasingly talks to each other about these issues, about economic policy, about social policy, and so on. But actually, and political incumbents, of course, have avenues to talk to each other on a that opposition movements have not been able to connect with each other across regions and indeed within regions. I mean, if I think of my own region, Southern Africa, opposition politics are very fragmented and they've not been able to connect with each other at all. So much more effort has to go into developing concepts of opposition dialogue, intra-opposition dialogue as well within particular countries. And I'll just, if I can, end with a sort of fifth or sixth point and make the point about populism, which is that it's not an ideology, but it's a political style that can be adopted by ideologues of the left or the right. Of course, the ideologues of the left tend to cause economic collapse through their particular adoption of economic policies, which tend to be, while they take power through democratic elections, usually they tend to ramp up state spending and not maintain the sort of fiscal discipline. And right-wing populists, on the other hand, tend to cause economic collapse because they go about conditions of social austerity and fiscal rectitude, which cause growing divisions within society. So it's more of a style than it is an ideology. But it is, I would argue, when it reaches the extremes, a response to increasing conditions of desperation and of alienation.
Thank you, Greg, for that perspective. I mean, one of the things when you were speaking, I was wondering on were two things. One, that if everyone accepts that for various African states have not been able to produce the kind of answers that their populations are asking for on the economic front and in terms of the governance front as well, then what next for people, right? A lot of those people have been excluded from the conversation and also how to reform systems. So if the state has failed, what is the place of citizens in that conversation without, reiterating some of the excesses you are talking about, sort of the extreme left end, which leads to economic collapse, or extreme right end, which again, from your perspective, leads to economic collapse? Is there a way in which ordinary people can engage in the policy process and speak the language and also ensure that the systems work for them? Is there a way for that? Robert, your thoughts?
Thank you very much. Is there a way to go about it? First of all, I just want to add my thoughts to the submission of Golda and indeed Greg, that it is a popular demand, a popular agitation. I also want to add that I also find the way the word populism is being used is rather derogatory. In my own view, populism is basically a popular voice or popular agitation or popular demand. Unfortunately, that populism is always used when it comes to either young people or a certain class that or an agitation that tends to challenge the status quo in terms of be it policy, be it about governance or even rights. How to go about it? In the present world today, where there's no more room for violence or violent disruption or violent change, I want to believe that the only way to go is to have the people, the population, demand for what they feel they deserve. It begins from them knowing they are citizens and they have full rights as citizens, and of course knowing and asserting it to those that rule over them, that they are in those offices in trust for the population, in trust for the people, especially the majority. So it's important to have those voices rise to demand. So the way forward, in my view, is to constantly have the people demand. This is what history has taught us, right from the civil rights movement to here in Africa in colonial times, more especially in countries that did not have to use violence to get their independence. And of course, looking at an example of South Africa and many other countries that have had to agitate through popular voices. So I believe that the way to go is to ensure that those that occupy the offices or occupy positions of responsibility are held to account, and the agitation continues from the population, especially the majority.
I mean, I thank you for that perspective as well. I mean, the question, and you have said it so beautifully, that if it is a democratic conversation, right, that the elites must touch base with the people they are claiming to govern and lead them to a particular project or vision of society. And there's a disconnect, and the people speak why the derogatory manner in which this is framed. And perhaps this is where to bring in Golda, because you have looked at what a lot of governments have been doing over the time. You've measured it, you've put out various kind of data and statistics around this. And I suppose you would confirm that for many African countries, results are not being produced by the policies put in place for right or wrong reasons. And so people are speaking because eventually, if you're promising them certain goods or public goods, you know, whether in the democratic governance space or whether in socioeconomic rights, at some point they're going to speak out. And it's also part of the democratic conversation. What is your sense about that, you know, that form of democratic engagement on the one hand? And also whether this allows the state to produce, you can see different results happening in the way in which policies are implemented in a conversation for around policy.
Right. To put it in context, so we have about 56 African states. Is it 54 African countries? About 25 of these are under authoritarian rule. Only one, that is Mauritius, seems to be meeting the criteria for an almost genuine democracy. The rest of us who are seen to be doing kind of okay, having a flawed democracy. So overall, if you take it, half of us are not yet in democracy, and then just one seems to be doing very well. The rest of us are just doing what we like. And that gives you the context of why we are possibly in the situation we're in. If this is the bird's eye view of the entire African continent, I am usually not surprised that most of our political leaders and our governments are more interested in maintaining the conditions that have allowed them to usually do what they prefer and get away with it, right? Because that has probably always been the trend from the very beginning, when from the 1950s, 1960s, when most of the African countries began coming out of colonial rule. What were the foundational setups for our democracies? And you find out that most of these setups were created mostly by the colonial people and handed over to people they had selected and felt these people should be put in charge. We were handed over to people who immediately felt this was their family property, this is their family company, and they can run it how they see fit and continue going down that path. And this has meant that most of us are not constitutionally solid. If you take Ghana, for example, and Professor Stephen, Azar, will tell you that the president, the last president who attempted to get our constitution amended was probably going against the law, because there's no portal in our constitution that allows our constitution to be amended. It's either going to be through very bloody civil unrest, or a president has to break the law to get it amended. And it tells you what the situation in most of our African countries is. We have democracies in quotes, and we have governments who really are not for the people or really by the people. They are just doing their own thing. A lot of the data that we have on returns, I call them returns on politics, as in return on investment. We vote for people, they declare themselves as democratically elected representatives for us. They go into the spaces to represent us. What actually happens is we're told they are representatives, and every 4 years or every 6 years, depending on the country you're in, we get a chance to get them out or keep them. But from the first year to the 4th year, they are actually not engaging with our people. When you ask them, they will tell you it's really difficult to constantly meet to decide on things with a large number of people. But in actual fact, you are the granular representation of the entire country. You should not have difficulties planning with your district representatives or your municipal representatives to have things devolved down to your people so that you can have more consensus, right? So we are supposed to have these representation, but in actual fact, they are not, because we don't see or hear from them until the 3rd and 4th year. And what this means is that any policies that are drawn are theoretically okay, theoretically perfect, but in reality, they cannot be implemented successfully. There's no ownership, there's no consensus, there's no insight. This means that we are constantly going to have tensions between the people and the leaders. And it surprises me all the time that leaders seem surprised and seem disappointed when their citizens rise up and start pushing the envelope, pushing the barriers. They seem surprised. Why should you be surprised when in actual fact you even refuse to keep data, you refuse to allow people to even build data? If you ask me how much insights we have on Africa, most of it is owned by the World Bank, IMF, OECD. Very few African owners are in the data space. So who exactly is putting this data together? How much of it is from us? How genuine is this data? And when you attempt to question it, you will find out that a lot of our governments and leaders really find data as the enemy. They do not want anything data related. How and why is because that's the only way they can continue doing what they're doing. How do you take someone to court and try them criminally or civilly if you don't have the evidence, right? So our approach is going to end us up, and I've been saying it, that we're going to end up in a lot of civil unrest around the country. The belief from most of the governments and the leaders is that they can control it, they can compress it, they can keep it down. But as we tend to see, the more you compress this kind of unrest, the more the pressure you build within, and it always pops, right? Sooner or later. Thank you.
I mean, I cannot disagree with you on this. I mean, I think one of the things we would all agree on, if you have a sense of history, is that if consistently the people are not finding an outlet, are not being engaged sufficiently, are not seeing their socioeconomic needs met, the political system seems to privilege a few people, then there's going to be a reaction. It's almost predictable that this would happen. Now, before I get to Greg, and there's so many interesting questions which are coming up, so maybe I'll take this last point from Greg and then invite our audiences in, because I could ask questions forever, is that you have talked about, the dangers of populism on both ends. And I kind of want you to give us your sense of what is the best way forward to manage the situation. Because as Golda said, a lot of times, a lot of the elites in the various African countries are not very honest and open as to what is happening with their own citizens, right? They're refusing data collection. They don't want that. And even in many instances, several governments have lied expressly to their people as to the state of affairs, only to reveal the real data in reports to the IMF or to the World Bank. So there's like the accountability to foreign publics is higher than to their own citizens. So where do we, how do we move to a path where there's a real engagement with people and there can be a pathway towards some of the things people are looking for?
Well, thank you very much, and to Bobi and Golda for those comments as well. Can you hear me okay? What I would say really builds on what Golda said a moment ago, and with risk of provoking controversy, I mean, I would fundamentally say that the principal challenge with African economies over the last 60 years has been that what happened in the immediate post-colonial environment is that you had one set of elites replaced by another set of elites. And the fundamental structure of the economies did not change markedly or sufficiently over the course of that 60 years to accommodate both the growing number as well as the aspirations of people who had become empowered over that intervening period. Because you had largely an elite-based system, which was protectionist, monopolistic, commodity extractive rather than inclusive, to use the Robinson-Amaglu thesis, that was really about servicing economies elsewhere in the interests of a very small bunch of people. And this is one of the reasons why you've had, I believe, continuous situations of political and economic instability, cyclical in many cases, with the role of outsiders coming in to restore a degree of stability, to be followed by a period of relative boom, and then overspending, fiscal recklessness, and then to be followed by another period of austerity. And in a place like Ghana, Golda, you know, I think it's 16 IMF programs over the last 60 years is evidence of that type of cyclical boom and bust nature of the economy. So the first point is really you have to get out of that. And I believe that what Asia did so successfully by comparison to Africa, and Asia is largely an aspiration now rather than something that can be directly imitated, is that it was characterized by an enormous commitment to popular welfare, whatever the political system of government, as well as a simultaneous level of discipline and planning and prioritization, which many African governments, for different sets of reasons, have not exhibited. So in Asia, there was a degree of populism, if you want to call it that, to use Bobi's concern about the terminology, which I would agree is particularly derogatory when used against those who aiming for this degree of popular welfare. There was a degree of populism, but it was directed at improving the lot of Asians over since the independence period, which more or less tracks in most cases that of African countries. I do believe, secondly, that in addition to a degree of political reform, almost revolution in the way in which economies are structured, in particular making it easy for people, smaller businesses, to employ and to operate and to reduce the frictional costs of doing business, which are massive in Africa, as I've just learnt over the last 5,000 kilometers of driving through this part of the continent. I mean, they're almost, you know, insurmountable for most small businesses just to deal with these costs and the bureaucratic hassles that go with it. In addition to that, you need a degree of political reform. And here, of course, there's a question about what's the role for insiders, what's the role for people inside Africa, inside the countries themselves, what role do they play, how do they seize control over their own destiny, how do they become empowered to become voters, to become citizens with those rights, as opposed to the role of outsiders. And generally, without going into too much depth, is the role of outsiders is largely to try and aim to get insiders to do their role, to do their job better. It's to support the systems of governance, support the systems of democracy, and to act in the interests of the majority of people within those countries. And I'm sure that Bobi will speak at length about the role of outsiders in the context of Uganda, where there's this tension between outsiders supporting their own external interests rather than the interests of democracy within Uganda. So this really goes directly to the question of elections and of the period between elections. Elections are not rigged on the day; they're rigged in the period between these events, and outsiders have to take a certain degree of responsibility for what they do in countries in terms of supporting these processes. And there's a great deal of variance here between donors. We know that. You know, some donors largely stay out, or they pretend to stay out of domestic politics. By pretending to stay out, they actually become involved because they're not supporting those governance systems, and the nature of their deal making, highly transactional, tends to support one side, which is usually the incumbent. And here I particularly think of the way in which China's gone about doing its business in Africa, but there are others to blame as well. So one has to scrutinize very carefully about what outsiders are doing in terms of support for these systems of political reform to enable a change, to go back to where I started, in the boom and bust, highly elitist, highly extractive, highly resource-based model of African economic activity that we've had, with some reform, but we've had largely in the post-independence period.
Thank you, Greg. This is perhaps, and I appreciate the points you've made. I think it ties in as well to a number of the questions we're seeing coming from the audiences. But one of the questions I want to start with first is from Filipowitz. who says, and perhaps to give a context to the question as well, it's about a lot of the questions that people ask continuously, whether is there something faulty with the democratic methods we have set up and the models we're using that do not allow a lot of people to be engaged in a conversation such that we shut the door to many people. And the question is asked here, and perhaps this I will send to Golda, is could the African democratic model necessarily require a seat in parliament for local clans and ethnic heads, like the PS system in the UK, or, you know, lacking a more parallel example, he said? Do you think a more indigenized way of our democratic institutions might be another way to address several of the concerns about exclusion and representation?
I believe that for as long as we're talking about forms of governance, you're dealing with people, we are not in the other world. You know, when you're dealing with spaces where there's life, it means there's constantly change. And because of that, you need to constantly keep reviewing your approach to things. I'm a firm believer in what works is what you need. And you can always change it as you grow. You can always transition. And that's why I get worried when leaders seem to want to entrench themselves in the same one thing and not want to move. My response to that would be, why not? Why not have an upper house where some of these traditional authorities and rulers and leaders can be brought in? The means by which they can be selected can always be discussed, whether it's through a plebiscite or it's through community-based conversations that will lead to a referendum. It should not be impossible, because at the end of the day, the more representation and dialogue you have, the less pressure you're building and having to deal with among the people. And any leader who is worth their salt knows that that's the best form of governance you want. There should not be too much pressure from any one side. And dialogue helps a lot with that. So I do agree that we could have a kind of democracy until it's no more necessary, that allows you to have that kind of double chamber representation.
Thank you, Golda. There's another question as well, which is perhaps one of my favorite topics, and it's talking about technology. And I'll send this question to Bobi in a minute. And the question is interesting because a lot of times when we think about representation and hearing people's voices, our reflex is to build more parastatal or state-level institutions, you know, like the example you've given of a second chamber or putting them in parliament. But is there a way in which we can deploy technology to drive enlightenment and engagement, as the question now is asking, and to be leveraged for governance? And before Bobi comes in, let me give one example. For instance, in the context of what is happening in Ghana today, which is the Fix the Country protest, it started mainly virtually with over 600,000 young people tweeting Fix the Country online, on Twitter. And over a period of 2 weeks, we've had 6 million tweets of people saying Fix the Country and pointing at bad roads, corruption, all socioeconomic problems with the system, and drawing attention to what has become now a growing demand for response from institutions. And one of the things we've seen is a pushback from the state, which is saying, well, Fix the Country, we don't know what you want us to fix, give us a list of demands. And the young people are pushing back and saying, well, there are 6 million tweets, right? 6 million tweets where people are cataloging specific issues. Why are you not going and looking at them? And the response of the state is, no, you cannot ask us to go and look on Twitter. You have to give us the lists in a paper form. So how do you see the role of technology, Bobi, in the way in which a lot of young people are coming into the conversation, in your experience of mobilizing, and also the understanding of various things and status quo of the virtual and technological space in engaging young audiences?
Thank you very much, Oliver. Indeed, technology has had both negative and positive, but largely positive. Of course, with every advantage comes a slight disadvantage. Besides the misuse of the communication, the misinformation, and others, I want to believe that technology has played a huge part in giving many people a voice. I'll speak largely in the context of Uganda. Technology and social media is largely the mother and father of the voices of Uganda here. You will notice that unlike many other places here in Uganda, Facebook is actually banned, and for anybody to access Facebook, they must use VPN. And the Minister of Information recently came out and warned that it is actually illegal to use VPN, thereby meaning it's illegal to access Facebook, even though the ministries, government ministries, and indeed the police itself communicates via Facebook. So it's kind of an irony. I'll also give the information that in 2017, the government of Uganda moved to put a tax on social media. So here in Uganda today, for anybody to access social media, you have to pay a tax, a daily tax of 200 Uganda shillings. Not so much money, however, for our population, which is over 80% living under the poverty line, it is restrictive. Of course, even our parliament recently moved to make it illegal for live broadcast on social media, live broadcast on TV, while the parliamentarians are deliberating. So that and more has affected the communication. But however, it also shines a light on the role of technology in the agitation, in the voices. Technology has given people a voice. I will also grab the opportunity to also tap a little bit into the question that you had asked Golda, and I'll say democracy is actually about the people. It should be about the people, and anything that gives the people the opportunity to take part in the political discourse, you know, is an enhancement to democracy. So as we speak today, technology is largely a voice giver to the people, and it is a threat to the status quo, which status quo is largely viewed, especially by the young people, as restrictive, as excluding the young people, and of course the poor. So while technology plays a huge part in the political discourse, while it plays a huge part in giving a voice to the people, especially the young people, to be involved, well knowing that that is the most, in my opinion, non-violent and yet assertive way of communicating and holding leaders accountable. It has pushed those in power to the defensive, and of course caused reprisal. So technology, largely here in Africa, and in more particularly in Eastern Africa and Uganda, to be precise, is a big mover to the political discourse. And I would think that the absence of the same, you know, kind of restricts the people, especially the masses, and more particularly the young people, from the political conversation. I will also mention that here in Uganda, as we speak today, technology is the only way out, as the public demonstrations are outlawed. Regardless of how peaceful they are always responded to with brute force. And technology, precisely social media, is the way out for anybody that needs a voice. So it's the mother and father of involvement here in Uganda as we speak.
Thanks, Bobi, for that. It connects to something Greg said as well, and I'm hoping to draw him into the conversation. One of the things you have said, and Fabrice is questioning around this, is that you've talked about the direct correlation between democracy and economic prosperity, he says. And I'm wondering from what Bobi's example is if traditional ways of engaging the state and moving the democratic conversation forward has been foreclosed to so many people, and we're seeing them move towards social media and into deploying technology to hold governments to account, to expose excesses. So you can say there's an expanding democratic culture among the youth, in engaging in these kinds of conversation. And we are seeing, the pushback against even that form of engagement. Then is there a path towards that economic prosperity, really, even as technology is being deployed and also be for good and for bad?
Well, thanks again for the questions and for the comments of the fellow panelists. I mean, 4 quick points. I mean, I would completely agree with what Bobi has said, that technology is a great leveler. It certainly helps to level the playing field. It's not a perfect leveler because it's available to both parties. So, and the games can be played with technology continuously. Fake news, turning the internet on and off, and clearly much more work has to be done in forcing, particularly I would argue, multinational telecommunications companies not to be allowed, if they have public listings overseas, to be allowed to be coerced politically in turning the internet on and off. This should be a big focus, I believe, of African opposition movements, that with companies that are listed internationally, they can't go to Africa and sort of play a different game that they would be expected to play in Europe or in Asia or in Latin America or wherever else. The big question, and Bobi has a much better handle on this than most, of course, is technology is one thing, but you've got to come up with a narrative. And what is that narrative for young people? Now, I have 3 teenagers, which is why the gray hairs are popping out, unlike Bobi. And 19, 17, and 15. And this is the world of Instagram. It's not the world of Facebook, at least in our household. It's the world of Instagram. It's the world of very short messages which have tremendous churn, tremendous tempo to them, and you've got to grab people's attentions. That said, and this is the crucial part, I believe, in this modern high-tech world, is we're so inundated with information and with messaging and with sophisticated messaging, sometimes fake and outrageous, but we've got so much coming at us. It actually, paradoxically, I would argue, makes relationships all the more important. It makes the soft skills, such as you are enabling today, Oliver, massively important, that we get to know each other, that we get to talk to each other, not through a medium of technology, but that we get to spend time together, we get to share notes. We may come from different political poles or ideological poles, but actually doesn't mean we don't get along and can work out common ground. These are the sorts of things that technology has now started, ironically, catalyzed and accelerated by COVID to enable. So I would argue that the premium is now, perhaps technology is a leveler, but the premium is actually on relationships and of people to get to know each other. On the question of, thirdly, on the question of traditional authorities, I'm slightly schizophrenic here, because yes, I see the advantages of having them inside the tent, undoubtedly. At the same time, many African traditional authorities have been among the worst in terms of reformist records on land tenure and things like this, which are extremely undemocratic in character. So you've got this enormous tension between democratic representativity for people who are elected through traditional means, but who also carry out the sorts of policies which are feudal in nature in many cases, and reform of those distributive aspects needs to be thoroughly re-examined, I would argue, if Africa is going to have a hope, particularly of commercializing agriculture on any scale and improving yield, which is an answer to at least part of the developmental challenge among a segment of the population. So yes to traditional representation as a way of maintaining political inclusivity, but also at the same time, they should not be excused their role and responsibility in the reforms that we need to carry out to provide for the tremendous demographic change that is upon us. And then finally, all of this, of course, any reform, to go to your specific question, Oliver, is about getting the politics right. You know, the politics, the political part of the political economy is absolutely crucial. And to go back to where I started, I think here, one of the big missing elements has been the ability of not of incumbents to talk to each other, but of opposition movements to build alliances, with outsiders as well as African insiders, to build and construct the systems of voter protection that enable them to win and to win big enough that they can be guaranteed transfers of power, whatever the tendencies within those countries. And I think Bobi, and among others, has shown the way as to how this can be achieved. But this is a tremendous task with incredible obstacles and incredible difficulties, requiring extraordinary commitment, courage of a sort that, frankly, I don't have, which one can only admire. But there is, you know, the oppositions in essence need to get really well organized. I would perhaps be boldly suggest better organized among themselves within their own organizations to be able to play their part in changing the politics to enable the political economy to look different to the boom and bust characteristics that I explained earlier.
Thank you, Greg, for that extensive set out. And I suppose in many ways for me, you've exhausted the questions around, you know, the politics, which is, I think when we think about it, it's mainly at the state level. I kind of want to bring Golda in because this point keeps coming up. I think I see Rodney as well has talked about this, that a lot of the prosperity that has happened in many countries is about growth in the middle class and expanding the middle class. And in as much as the state has a role to play in that, I think conventional wisdom today is that even the efforts of the state must enjoy the full complements of private initiative. Now, staying on the question of technology, is there a way, or are you seeing any trends in that technological element being deployed for African businesses to grow, to be able to expand and absorb a large section of the population that have been excluded from employment and money-making opportunities? How do we deploy that to see about that growth in the middle class that would yearn for much more grounded systemic changes? And perhaps this will be our last question before we take a break for the next panel. Thank you.
There are definitely opportunities. I believe that in their own private capacity, a lot of Ghanaian developers and coders and builders of apps have found immense pockets of opportunities to build things and contribute to technology. And if you pay attention, actually, it's not a new thing. We've got some very fascinating people in NASA, right, leading very high-level efforts. So there's definitely an opportunity there. The only thing is that most of these people will tell you they would love to contribute somehow to building the next generation of these kind of people here in Ghana. And most of the time, the space is not conducive. It's not nurtured. We don't have too much going on very well at our basic education level when it comes to anything computer or IT. A lot of our children usually end up having to get very familiar and conversant with digital literacy and that space much later than they should be. So if we want more and more of our citizens to be able to find those opportunities, we must nurture and enable a lot more of our experts in the technology space to be able to nurture people and connect them to the opportunities that they've had. We should be able to, while we're bringing Google and Twitter into Ghana to set up their headquarters, we should be able to ask ourselves, what kind of knowledge sharing or capacity building agreements have we put in place to ensure that, you know, Ghanaians will be able to take most of the roles that are available and be able to not just work here and contribute, but stay and keep on building the next generation. Technology is a way forward. Data is a way forward. There are huge opportunities in that space. If the government is eager to appreciate the efforts of the foreign tech companies, then I'm very sure that they also know the immense opportunities that are here if they help our own people to set up and grow.
Well, there's an interesting question that has come, but since we are breaking up now, I'll throw this to the audience for them to continue to engage with. And this is from Vincent Ekowakofu, who is saying that with respect to Golda's point on data, I mean, against the backdrop of multiple cases of data misuse and abuse of people's privacy, how is policy going to take care of these issues, more especially in evolving democratic countries on the continent? And I think this is something that involves both the public sector, but also the private sector as well, as to the use of data and the way in which we are planning policy to regulate data, or even the ways in which it's been misabused to repress citizens.
Can I quickly touch on that?
To talk about it.
Okay.
Look forward to continue to engage for the next panel. We take a break now for 5 minutes and rejoin you. Thank you.